Introducing NASM One, NASM's ultimate membership program. Unlock access to everything your fitness career needs to succeed. Unlimited CEUs, free courses, access to our premium app, and exclusive discounts, all for $35 a month. NASM One is best-in-class tools, cutting-edge certifications, confidence in your craft, and everything you do as a personal trainer made easy, so we can achieve our greatest goals together as one.
You're listening to the Mindful Drinking Podcast with Derek Brown on the NASM Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Mindful Drinking Podcast, where we talk about mindful drinking, no and low alcohol cocktails, and social wellness. My name is Derek Brown. I'm your host. I'm a certified wellness coach, award-winning bartender, and author of Mindful Mixology, a comprehensive guide to no and low alcohol cocktails. Now, there's a joke that I heard a long time ago that apparently is from a kind of old-timey comedian. And that old-timey comedian, Henny Youngman, said that he was so alarmed by what he had read about drinking alcohol, the evils of drinking alcohol, that he decided to give up reading. And so that's something that I can relate to, and I'm sure some of you all can as well, that sometimes we come across these subjects, these topics, and we learn about them, and then it just makes us kind of feel in a panic or bad about what we've been doing, and we feel like we have to change course. And I don't think any subject has done that more recently than ultra processed foods. And there was a podcast called the Better Than Fine podcast, or Better Than Fine podcast, with Darlene Marshall, who's going to join us in a little bit, where she talked about ultra processed food. And immediately I was like, oh my gosh, I have been feeding myself and my son just the worst stuff: cereal, hot dogs, blah, ramen. Oof, I kind of already knew that wasn't great. But I think that it at first really alarmed me, and then it kind of settled in, and I realized, well, I mean, ultimately, some of this stuff is still delicious. I'm not going to give it all up, but maybe I can start to make a few choices that incorporate whole foods and healthier foods. And so as I started to do that, instead of chicken nuggets, making chicken breasts, instead of doing flavored yogurt, doing a natural yogurt with a little bit of honey, things like that are really just small steps. I started feeling a little bit more relaxed and like this is something that I can do. But just to alarm myself a little bit more, I decided to start thinking about ultra processed beverages, which obviously fall under the same category. They have all this sort of sugar and carbonation and preservative and things that I don't even know what they mean. They're on the label, but I have no idea what they're there for. And so rather than get alarmed again, I decided that I was going to invite Darlene Marshall, who is a wellness coach, a master wellness coach, who is a master's in positive psychology and a good friend of mine, to come and talk about it on the show. So that way, maybe we can get a little bit more insight and not feel so alarmed, or maybe get more alarmed. I don't know. Darlene, how are you?
I'm well, thank you, though I'm concerned about your degree of alarm. I've certainly joked plenty of times that stressing about eating ice cream might be worse for you than just eating the actual ice cream. And so my intention for you, for your listeners, for everyone, is not to cause alarm, to just give accurate information and help people figure out how to apply it in their lives. So thank you for having me on the show. I'm very excited to be here.
Yeah, no problem. And I knew that you were going to do that. And I knew that you're going to put us at ease at the same time, give us some good information. But I'm just going to really start out by asking you a question about you and your background. And I don't know if you saw this, but for today, I wore a special t-shirt.
Nice shirt.
So tell us a little bit about your path. Like, how did you get to become a wellness coach? And tell us a little bit about positive psychology.
Absolutely. And for the listener who's not watching on YouTube, he's got a University of Pennsylvania shirt on, which is where
Yeah.
I got my master's in applied positive psychology. So I came to positive psychology from the fitness space, and I came to the fitness space from being an actor. So I came out of the entertainment industry. In my early 20s, I was diagnosed with a chronic illness and given a pretty poor prognosis, essentially told, like, prepare yourself for a sedentary life. And at the time, I was like the cliche comedic actor, haha funny on stage, but like not great mental health, really treating my body like a rental car. And it was that diagnosis and this prognosis that really got me interested in, like, okay, there's got to be some ways that my lifestyle could impact these outcomes. And that's what got me walking that path of what happens when I change my diet, what happens when I move my body differently, when I learn about functional movement, strength training. And so when I became a personal trainer 13 years ago, it was always with the intention of helping other people with like weird stuff learn how to live well in whatever condition and body they were in. And from the lens of, it's not about what's wrong with you. It's about figuring out how you live well with what all the things are right with you. And I didn't know then that that's a really positive psychology framing. It was, you know, 8 years in the fitness industry, just collecting certifications like they were Pokemon cards. But I ended up really frustrated that a lot of my clients were still struggling to live well because of their mindset. And it was while doing work on myself, while going through a divorce, that I discovered the tools of positive psychology. I dove headfirst into them, thinking, not only is this helping me, but why isn't every fitness professional educated in these tools? Is such a completely different way of thinking about the work we're already doing. This was before the pandemic. I got into UPenn's positive psychology program. I was the class of 2020, not knowing what was coming,
Wow.
and really had this vision of fitness professionals with these tools. And then, of course, we all know what happens in March of 2020. Pandemic hits, and suddenly everyone desperately needs tools to live well. I was very fortunate that some of the people who work for NASM discovered my show and my work, and they reached out to me to say, hey, we're working on this new wellness certification, but we're having a hard time with the movement piece because everyone in the network at the time really thought of it like a personal trainer, right? Movement or outcome based. How do we design movement to create specific physical adaptation, which is a very personal trainer lens. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It's just very different than, what if I move because it feels good? What if I'm moving for my mental health? What if movement is a source of joy, of happiness, of connection, of community? And that's really what got my ball rolling, getting to contribute to that certification, to other NASM tools and channels, and ultimately getting to be an educator with them on wellness coaching. So it's been a cool journey. It's been a really, ultimately sitting now in this place where it's a 360 holistic viewpoint on the human experience. And what does it really mean when we say living well? And what does that look like for each of us? And how do we figure it out for ourselves? Which is super fun.
That's amazing. And I mean, what a journey. There's like so many things in that I wanted to touch on, but I know that we have another topic we're going to get to. But the one thing that I didn't realize, because we've known each other for a while, but the one thing I didn't realize is that you were a comedic actress. I knew that you were actress, but I did not know that you were a comedic actress. So I hope that you told jokes better than I did in the beginning of this.
Well, funny about that is that what I actually was good at, and maybe hopefully still am, is being the straight man. So I would be the stone face that other people were playing haha against, which I think is the harder part, Derek, but let's find out.
Absolutely hard. I think of Norm Macdonald. He always had that kind of straight face telling these ridiculous jokes. So,
yup.
So we're going to get to ultra processed foods, everybody, and ultra processed drinks. But I just, a little side note is that I recently redid my character strengths, which is a part of positive psychology that I'm going to ask you to explain in a second. But I redid them, and top of the list was spirituality, love of learning, love. Bottom of the list was comedy for me.
So I say all the time I'm not funny, so it's all, so you're picking up on themes here. Yeah, I have very similar. Those three are in my top 5 too.
Oh, good. Excellent. So would you take 1 second to describe character strengths? I know we didn't plan this, but I know you know.
Yeah,
It sounds
absolutely.
better
I'm
than me.
happy to.
Yeah.
Your listeners might be familiar with the concept of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, put out by the American Psychological Association. And essentially, that is a manual of how do we diagnose and classify mental health problems, dysfunction in the mind. And the grand poobahs of positive psychology, Martin Seligman and Christopher Peterson, in the 90s, late 90s, early aughts, were saying, hey, instead of focusing on what's wrong with people, why don't we come up with a criteria for what's right with people? Like, what are the characteristics that we ubiquitously value as human beings? Things like love and humor and beauty, excellence, bravery. And how would we classify those strengths in ourselves? And what they settled on was 24 characteristics that we all have all of these strengths. It's just that some of them we really lean into and they really feel like us. And then it's not that you don't have humor, right? It's that it's something that you use a bit less. Because I've spent time with you. I know you can be very funny. And so it's that, well, I tend to lean into my love of learning, spirituality. I love science, but I also like the woo, right? I tend to lean into those things more, but that doesn't mean that I don't have all this other stuff, self-regulation and bravery and creativity. It's that there's certain things that just really feel like us. And the evidence points pretty strongly to when we intentionally use those strengths and have them highlighted, especially by people that we see as like us. So, like Derek, if you paid me a compliment of like, oh, right now you're, I don't know, whatever strength I might be failing to come up with a word for right now, that's going to give me a boost. Or even if I sit with you and we talk about strengths that we observe in Eric, our excellent shared producer, that will give all of us collectively a boost because it feels good to know that you are good. And many of us are good in the same ways, but it just gets expressed differently. And then there's all kinds of other exercises you can do. So anybody who wants to take their own character strengths assessment, I'm trying to remember the website, but I know it's Values in Action. If you just search like VIA character strengths, it's free. You can take the assessment and they have free tools on that website. It's pretty great.
Yeah, I've done it 3 or 4 times, and one of the character traits that I'm going to use right now shows up in my middle traits all the time. Is, you mentioned it, bravery, and so I'm going to use a little bit of bravery right now, and I'm going to ask you, what are ultra processed foods?
Yeah, let's step into it together. We'll hold hands and take deep breaths. So I think the easiest way to talk about what ultra processed foods are might be to talk about how we classify foods in general, and that will lead us to what they aren't. So the NOVA food classification scale is a 4-point scale that researchers use to classify how much processing is in a food that's being sold to us. And so a Nova 1 is, I picked the apple off the tree, I dusted it off, I bit it, it's an apple, right? So it's a naturally occurring foodstuffs. So fish and meat and plants and grains and things that maybe I took a peel off or a husk off or took the seeds out, but the food thing that I'm eating is naturally occurring. A Nova 2 is like there was a little bit of processing. So I took the honey out of the honeycomb, I tapped the maple tree and then distilled down to, the maple syrup. A Nova 3 is what's called the culinary ingredients. So, it's table sugar, it's whole flours that have been ground, but there isn't any industrial compound involved. So the culinary ingredients might be a combination of ones and twos. So it might be like salted butter, right? I had to churn the butter and then I mix it with salt. That's a culinary ingredient. So it is processed technically, but there's no industrialized compound in the processed food. And then what we call an ultra processed food is anything that has an industrialization component. So there is some kind of industrial chemical preservative. There is I keep saying, is it emollient or emulsifier? Emollient or emulsifier. But there are compounds in it that change the texture, that make it more shelf stable. And I think it's really important as we step into this conversation to recognize that there are all kinds of benefits as a society and as individuals to ultra processed foods. And I grew up on food stamps. I grew up in poverty. And without ultra processed foods being available, my parents, my mother, who worked 3 jobs, could not have fed 3 children. So there are incredible benefits to processing in general: shelf life, shelf stability, food accessibility. You think about parts of the world where they're experiencing food insecurity and we're trying to get food into those areas. Well, if the food showed up rotten, that wouldn't be very helpful. And so we want to be mindful of not just demonizing ultra processed foods across the board, to recognize that there are some benefits to them. And also, for those of us that have the privilege of choice, what are the choices we're actually making when presented with them? So hopefully that gives you at least a working idea that when we say ultra processed, we mean that there's some kind of industrial processing that went into the thing that's in your hand that you're about to put in your mouth.
Oh, that makes perfect sense, and something that I've experienced a lot. Some examples I had mentioned earlier on in the episode, but one that was top of mind is my son was asking, "Why do I have to have eggs for breakfast? Why can't I have cereal this morning?" And I was like, you know what? I never want to give up cereal. Cereal is so delicious. I'm sorry, Cinnamon Toast Crunch. Come on. But at the same time, maybe now I recognize, like, maybe I treat that like ice cream. That's like an every now
Yeah,
and
it's
then kind of
dessert
thing.
for breakfast. And I think it's helpful when we frame that something like, I'm always mindful of in my naming a product, but something like a hyper sweets, we call it a super normal stimulus. It's a stimulus that's greater than would be naturally occurring. Foods that fall into that category have been engineered to be desirable. And so the flip side of industrial processing is just like, and I don't want to sound like, I always say, like, I don't want to sound cuckoo bananas. I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist here, but we do want to consider, just like the social media and other games on your phone have been designed to cause hyperfixation, to hack our dopamine system. So have our these hyper palatable foods, where the texture, the flavor, not just the sweetening, like you see the sweeteners on the back of the box, but the 0-calorie sweeteners that wouldn't show up in the caloric breakdown, they're still in there, and that's still affecting your subconscious craveability for those foods. And so it makes sense that your son was like, yeah, I want this particular cereal because it tastes so good. And at the same time, it was designed to make him feel that way. And when we recognize that that's the case, and then we own that for adults, 60% of the calories we eat are ultra processed in America. For kids, it's 70 to 75. They don't have a fully developed prefrontal cortex, and like they're living in the hypothalamus, right? Like they're living in the parts of the brain that are all impulse. And so then they're being presented with foods designed to create those impulses. And so, yeah, it's hard. It's a hard thing to manage. And I think all of us are challenged with finding our line with these things.
Yeah. You're listening to the Mindful Drinking Podcast. My name is Derek Brown, and we're talking about ultra-processed drinks and ultra-processed foods and positive psychology. We're with Darlene Marshall, and we're going to get right back into it. So we were talking about a particular cereal that maybe I shouldn't name. I don't know. But I love it a lot. It's a delicious one, and my son loves it, and I do too. But we shouldn't eat it all the time. And I think that you started to touch on super normal stimulus, which were obviously things that are just kind of outsized in the way that they affect our dopaminergic pathway or what have you. And so we need to be cautious of that. Those things range obviously from food to drinks as well. And what I wanted to mention there is very soon coming up on my show, I'm going to have Dr. Edward Slingerland, who wrote a book called Drunk. And in it, he was talking about how basically liquor itself, distilled spirits, if you will, is an intensified version of beer and wine, right? Like beer and wine. On the last podcast that I did, it was about how much is too much. And we talked about beer and wine having a lower alcohol by volume, or ABV, and spirits having a higher volume because it's a concentrated version of beer or wine in that case. So I think that that's another example of something that could, fall into that category. I think I'd have to explore that a little bit more, but certainly the idea is that it's something that we really, crave and is a little bit more intense than our sort of quote unquote natural experience. So I get that.
Yeah. And in the scientific literature, how it's laid out, alcohol specifically, it is a bit unclear to me where we draw the line with specifically alcohol processing between a 3 and a 4. So the culinary ingredient to the ultra processed, because you probably know more about this, Derek. And I was excited to get to ask you this question on the mic. Sorry to dump one on you too. I've read anecdotally around fermentation acceleration in alcohol manufacturing. Is there any publicly available way for us to tell which beverages have been have had accelerated chemical fermentation versus the ones that would be, just like left to their own devices? Is that publicly available information? Because I would consider that to be ultra processed at that point.
Yeah, I think that let's get into ultra processed drinks. I mean, I think that, when we talk about alcohol, we're talking about one of the most highly manipulated processes on the planet.
Yeah.
And I say that with gentleness and kindness because some of those processes, even though they're manipulated, we could consider that they may fall in 3 or something like that. I don't know for sure. I'm not going to be able, I think, today to delineate that. And one of the reasons is what you're pointing out, is that we can go and investigate that particular distillery or winery or brewery, and we can learn more about what they do. But on the label itself, it doesn't say anything about that. We don't know if it's natural yeast. We don't know if it's, a lab created yeast. We don't know if it's an accelerated fermentation process. In fact, we don't even have a nutritional value on the alcohol itself. So that is something that's hotly debated, something that I definitely think that we need to address a little bit more, is that we don't always know. And here's the other kicker to that, is that there's a certain small percentage that doesn't have to be identified. So for instance, when we're talking about wine production, there can be some coloration or even something called chaptalization, which is essentially adding in sugar in a small amount that you don't even list in any of the ingredients. So it gets kind of into a weird territory, and it's something I would like to know more about. But in fact, I guess I've spent most of my career investigating, but I can't put out an entire book about every bar or every brewery, winery, and distillery and what they are using. So I think we all have to be a little bit more concerned about that.
Totally anecdotally, like when I have, I can drink a beer in Europe and I'm fine. I drink a beer in the US and I get chest pains. And I just had to stop drinking beer when I'm on this side of the pond. And for years I couldn't figure out why. And then somebody who worked in alcohol, it's like, oh, well, it's industrial chemical fertilization. I was like, oh, there's stuff in this that I don't know what's in it. Got it. Cool. Thanks.
And there's sometimes behavioral aspects to that too. Like I often mention that, like, when we're in other countries or we might be walking more, we might be doing other behaviors around health that could change the way that we ingest it or what have you. So there's lots of things happening there. I don't know particularly with you, but I'm just saying in general, there's lots of things that can happen.
I buy that.
But okay, so let's switch. We've totally switched to ultra processed drinks. We talked about alcohol, and one of the things, obviously, with mindful drinking is we're saying, there is no amount of alcohol that's healthy, regardless of all of the other things in it. The scientific consensus is more or less that you can't have a drink and say it's healthy. That's just not the way it is. You can live a healthy lifestyle.
Healthy.
Exactly. That incorporates alcohol, but you can't say that alcohol itself is healthy. And I think that that's fair. But when we talk about non-alcoholic products, generally there's this concept or idea that they are healthy. And I think that, it's a little bit of a trade-off, but I wonder if that trade-off for everyone is worth it. Because I certainly understand that if you're in recovery and you can't drink alcohol because you have a substance use disorder, that's totally makes sense, right? Substance use disorder is a very debilitating thing, and for many people, they can't have alcohol, any alcohol. So that's one thing. But for those people who are just kind of saying, well, I want to be healthier, so I'm not drinking alcohol, so I'm going to drink this RTD or ready to drink cocktail with no alcohol, but it's got sugar, it's got carbonation, it's got preservatives. Talk to me about that.
I mean, so sugar, it depends.
Mhm.
Carbonation, my general understanding, is less concerning than something like artificial flavors, artificial sweeteners, whatever preservative compound we're looking at. So generally, we've been taught to worry about things like glycemic index. So what's this sugar going to do to my blood sugar and therefore my metabolism and my downstream health? What we as the public have not necessarily been getting out of the currently available research, and there was just a meta-analysis in Nature in the last week of February on ultra-processed foods and the effect on total health.
Mhm.
And it essentially said that, hey, we've been taught to look at this one factor, and actually it's a meta-analysis. So here's a whole body of evidence that shows these other compounds, so these preservatives, artificial colorings, artificial flavorings, are actually damaging the gut microbiome, the gut lining. They're causing systemic inflammation. I'm guessing that many of your listeners have heard of leaky gut, which is when our gut lining and microbiome have been damaged in such a way that partially digested food or other compounds that shouldn't be in the bloodstream are making it through the barrier of the gut into the bloodstream, which then causes systemic inflammation. It causes autoimmune responses that are not helpful to us, and then also can cause damage to the metabolism and metabolic functioning. So we're finding that artificial sweeteners, we've been all kind of trained to this idea of like, okay, I'll have a low calorie sweetener or an artificial sweetener. Well, now we're seeing evidence that actually that might be worse for us than sugar. And I think of it the way that margarine turned out to be worse for us than just butter.
Right.
And so I often say to my clients, the people I work with, that nutrition science is actually very young.
Mhm.
And we want to be mindful that it's also the research done on many of these compounds is very short term. It's often done in rodents and looking at rodent models. And then they might introduce it to a small human population and go, is it poison? Nope, not poison. Cool. And so that means that we're kind of in a mass public health social experiment that we are calling processed food, ultra processed food. And so when we look at these like pre-made cocktails and you're looking at the ingredients on the back, we also want to be mindful that like there might be coatings in the can. There's all kinds of ways that beverage could have been manipulated that might not be as simple as, well, does it have less sugar, no alcohol, less calories than some other thing? And the frustrating thing is that for some of this stuff, we just don't know. And I'm not trying to be alarmist. I'm just trying to be honest. For some of it, we just don't know yet. And then each of us is left, like we said before, to find your line of, well, what's so worth it to me that like, it doesn't matter. Or the dose makes the poison, right? Just like with alcohol, sugar, the dose makes the poison. We know way too much makes you sick. With anything that we're putting in our bodies, the dose makes the poison. And somebody who's occasionally having an artificially flavored beverage once in a while, but otherwise has a great nutrition profile, it's probably not going to have leaky gut. But if we're, really consistently pumping in these other compounds, we don't really know what's going on.
Well, you're listening to the Mindful Drinking Podcast. I'm Derek Brown, and we're talking today about ultra-processed drinks, which follows on the foot of ultra-processed foods. And we're doing so with Darlene Marshall, who is sharing a lot of great information with us, not just about ultra-processed food and drinks, but about positive psychology. And we're going to get to soon aspects of motivation as well. So I thank you for that. That was a really interesting kind of point. I mean, I think that, if you are, having this in moderation, and maybe honestly, you should not be slamming like RTD cocktails on a night, right? Like, I think it sounds like something that, just like alcohol itself, or really, anything, as you said, as long as you do it in a fashion that's moderate, or you're not doing a lot, and you're otherwise have a healthy nutritional profile, that you're probably going to be in good shape. But one point that I like to add, and I think it's inherent in what you're saying, is that science itself is always evolving, right?
Mm.
So as you're saying that the nutritional science is young, as young as it is, it's going to keep growing and changing based on our methods of science, based on replicated studies, based on all this stuff. So it should be normal and natural for those listeners out there now, although I know it's normal and natural for you, to understand that this stuff is just going to keep building and changing, and that sometimes it hits a consensus that is a fairly, not carved in stone, but close to it. And sometimes it's just something that's going to take time to really develop.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you wanted to comment on that too.
Yeah. I want to be really clear that I think there's a lot of chatter on social media and influencer culture around demonizing ultra processed foods in general. And like, the cliche right now is the influencer like walking down the grocery aisle and like pulling out something and reading the label and be like, don't eat this. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm saying, hey, be aware and find your line for you. And as somebody who like grew up on Elio's pizza and Cheerios, and necessarily so, like that kept us going. And so I think that it's okay to work in degrees, right? Like you mentioned, like, okay, your son's having eggs for breakfast a lot of the time now. That's just one tick up degree, right? And so there's nothing wrong for the listener to just, how can you make one little shift at a time in a way that works in your life and for you? But what I'd love to see in the scientific evidence, and I hope that this happens in the next 5 to 10 years, is we see that NOVA 4 classification break out into like, okay, 4 A's and B's, like through E's and F's, where we start to parse out the degree of processing and an awareness of, all right, unprocessed sunflower oil, but everything else in it is, or excuse me, unheated, so unhydrogenated sunflower oil. But everything else in that food is a culinary ingredient. You're probably fine. These other things where, it's just a chemical storm. I had to filter out the curse in that one. The chemical storm. Insert your favorite inappropriate word there. That one we know is like highly carcinogenic. It's going to just trash your gut microbiome and don't bother, Yeah. And so that is my hope, is that we gain the degree of nuance that right now this conversation so desperately needs. And for the rest of us in the meantime, navigating, okay, where's your line? And maybe the line is, and this is my line too, is like, if I'm on a road trip or I have a very early flight, do I go and grab an energy drink? Yeah, maybe a few times a year. I've had, McDonald's French fries in the last year, but I'm not having it all the time because that's my line.
Right.
And where is your line, right?
Darlene, in a way, could we say that you should be mindful about what you drink?
I was going to say intentional, but sure, we can go with mindful.
That's amazing. And I love this all, because I think, it's really just getting to the point where we say, we can definitely consume these things within our own experience and based on our own necessity, or, obviously, like I said, some people have problems drinking alcohol. They should not drink alcohol. Other people are holding off for whatever reason. And some of us drink and we do it in moderation, or we do it in an amount that we feel is, goes along with our goals. And that's mindful drinking in a nutshell. I want to switch topics just a little bit, even though I know this is the core of what we're talking about today. But I know that because you're a positive psychology expert, that you also know a lot about human motivation, and that you understand that sometimes it is hard to avoid, if you're in a situation where somebody is pushing a beverage on you, let's say with alcohol or an ultra processed beverage, they're pushing something on you that you feel uncomfortable drinking, but you want to be part of the group, you want to connect with everybody else, you want to cheers everybody else, whatever it is. What would you say we can do? I mentioned some of the ways that we could do this in previous episodes, how to drink mindfully, but I wonder what your approach might be in a situation like that.
Yeah, this actually happened to me recently, and I thought of you. I was at a work event. I was speaking at an event, and they had a bunch of really cheap, clearly industrially produced alcohols that I knew were going to cause me physical pain. And I'd already had a pretty bad headache at this cocktail party, but I was trying to power through. And this person kept coming up to me and like shoving cups of cheap wine in my hand. And I thought of you then. So it's interesting to have you ask the question. What I did in that circumstance was just let it touch my lips and I wasn't taking it into my body so that I could pass essentially. Because in that circumstance, it would have been socially awkward. It was a professional environment. And that was me mimicking a behavior that would pacify what essentially was an external stimulus of reward and punishment. Right? If I did the thing they wanted me to do, I would get the social reward of approval. If I didn't do it, I would get the social punishment of mild ostracizing. Right? And we are hardwired as mammals to react to that. That kind of negative evolutionary stimulus would have been really damaging to our ancestors, right? You do a thing that might cause a bit of guilt or shame. It's out of fear that if you're not in the social in-group, it could be really dangerous for our evolutionary ancestors. And so shame, blame, and guilt are only motivating in the moment that you're experiencing that fear, that negative bias, or reward, system of reward. Like if we all think of like bonuses at work, I'm only going to do the extra 5 hours of work if the bonus is worth it to me, right? Otherwise, I wouldn't choose to have done that work in the first place. And so those are really external motivators versus the things that we do because they align with our identity, they align with our values. And so me as somebody who puts a really high value on my health, my state of well-being, not having migraines, I was willing to mimic because my identity as a person who doesn't drink that stuff was more important than if somebody realized that I was actually pantomiming, right? And so I think in that situation, I'm going to just roll with it as best I can. Now, in a social situation where I was in people that actually know me, I would have had some choice words about the social pressure and they would have laughed about it and we would have moved on, right? Because I'm not going to be spending like real time with people who would treat me that way. And so it really depends what's the situation I'm in and how can I navigate it? So with clients, when we know they're going to be in situations like that, like, okay, well, can I cut the wine with some seltzer? Can I modify this, situation I'm in a way that allows me to move through it? How can I adapt and overcome in a way that aligns with my identity, my values, my needs, and the circumstances I find myself in?
I think that's great. And I love landing on intrinsic motivation because I think that to me is also the heart of mindful drinking. It's not about me telling people you should or shouldn't drink. You should or shouldn't drink even ultra processed drinks. Although I do often plug no and low alcohol cocktails. I do recognize that they're, like I said, you shouldn't be slamming them down just the same way that you're doing. I don't think anybody's doing a non-alcoholic beer bong out there, but if they are, you should not.
Send me a video if you are. But I'll throw this out there, Derek. Like, I think when we're talking about ultra processed, we're specifically talking about pre-packaged, right? Mm-hmm. No low alcohol. That isn't to say that there aren't plenty of options. I know you put out recipes on your socials around, here's a herbal tea infused with, this cool other thing. I don't know. You're the beverage guy. But there are certainly ways in which culinary ingredients and naturally occurring ingredients can create delicious combinations of things that don't necessarily have to involve a lot of these ultra processed or preservatives or things out of cans, right?
That's right. And I can think of one recipe in particular in my mind that I think is super would be super helpful for somebody who's like, okay, now I can't drink anything. It's like, no. There's
No,
plenty
no,
of
no.
things you can drink. But if you are very concerned, one beverage that gets touted as a health beverage again and again, and it has a pretty good consensus behind it, is tea, right?
Oh, yeah.
Especially when we talk about green tea. But there's a tea that I really love called Lapsang Souchong tea, right? And it's a smoky tea from China. And it essentially has some of those characteristics that you get out of like a good scotch, where it has that like smoky. It's actually cured over pine fires. And I use about 2 ounces of that. I add to it honey, and then some kind of aromatic bitters, which are processed, but are, there's a company that makes them. I forget who, if I'm allowed to mention them or not, but they make all natural, ingredients. They're literally just peeling it by themselves and putting it into the bottle. So there's a lot of really good stuff in there.
So that would be processed, not ultra processed, no industrial compounds. So dried herbs is just culinary ingredients. That's a 3.
Perfect. So that, and then an orange peel, and you've got an old fashioned style drink that's smoky, that's a little sweet, a little rich, a little intense. I think something like that would be a great example of how you really can still make excellent, delicious, non-alcoholic drinks. That and I do want to touch on one other thing. There's a lot of people talk about things like natural wine, right? And they talk about clean wines. I just want to clarify for people: clean wine is no official designation at all. It's almost a meaningless statement. And the idea of natural wines, there could be some that are more minimally processed. That's true, but it's an array of different processes that you'd have to really look a lot deeper into to just give it a full scale, like this is great, no problem, green light. So just to clarify that, natural wines or quote unquote clean wines aren't exactly the escape route for this.
Yeah, you bring up a good point around kind of what's frustrating across the board in the ultra processed food conversation is marketing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Marketing and labeling. That at the end of the day, we're in a capitalist society, no judgment about that, but also these corporations, these food producers, they got a bottom line. And so if as public perception shifts, and I think one of the two great examples of this is we talked about sugar and calories on the back of the label. And now that everybody's talking about eating enough protein. So what's happened in the last 10 years? Well, artificial sweeteners have replaced high caloric sweeteners, so that now the calorie count on the thing is lower, the sugar reported is lower, but now we know that metabolically isn't healthy. And a lot of manufactured foods have started getting protein powders added to them. So now you can say like, oh, see, look, this has got 5 grams of protein in it. That makes them even more processed.
Right.
And so whether we're talking about food or we're talking about beverage, the label is often a marketing tool that manipulates perception, not necessarily indicative of the health status of what's inside it, which is so frustrating for us as we're trying to be mindful consumers.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just had a moment when you were talking where I thought about the fact when you were talking about protein and adding protein to things, and they do it to everything now.
Yeah,
I was like, we're very close to a world where we have like protein infused tequila. It's happening, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah.
Somebody's mind right now. I'm begging you though, don't do it, people.
Please don't do it. Don't do it. No one wants that.
I wish that was true. But okay, listen. Thank you so much, Darlene, because this is so much great information. I know that you and I could talk for hours, and that there's a lot more. So hopefully we can continue this conversation at some point. And I just want to remind people out there, ultimately, it's about being mindful, and as Darlene mentioned, doing sort of intrinsic goals, like setting the goals for yourself and trying to stick to them and find the motivation to stick with them within yourself. Because it's not that you should never have these things. It's that you should make sure that they fit with how you want to feel and your overall picture of health and what you want that to be. And so before I sign off, I want to remind you that if you are interested in entering a chance to win a $100 gift certificate, you can go in the show description and you can tell us a little bit about NASM and how we're doing in the podcast network, because we'd love to hear more from you. And I would love for you, obviously, to like and comment on my show as well. Darlene, thank you so much for being here, and we'll see y'all next time.